Hey YouTube, welcome back to the channel. Liam Douglas here, coming at you from Roxborough, North Carolina. And in today's Photography 101 video, we're going to be talking about ISO and how it affects your images. But before we get started, be sure to check out the Liam Photography podcast, my bi-weekly podcast. I have a back catalog of 328 episodes. You can subscribe in your favorite podcatcher, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever. And you can go ahead and give all the back episodes a listen. And I release new episodes every Sunday and Thursday. Okay, so let's get into today's topic, which is ISO. Now, ISO has to do with how sensitive your camera sensor is to the ambient light in your scene. Now, in the days of film photography, film stock was labeled either ISO or ASA, which could be a bit confusing, and it depended on who was making the film, which acronym they used. But all that mattered was the number after the three-letter acronym, because that actually told you what speed the film was, whether it was 100, 200, 400, 800, whatever the case may be. So in today's modern cameras, ISO is standardized and it's all electronic. Now, I don't mean standardized in that everybody uses the same scale, because each manufacturer approaches ISO a little bit differently. That's not super important, so you don't need to worry about that. When I shot with Canon cameras, Canon's base ISO on their professional bodies was ISO 100, and then on their consumer bodies like the Rebel line, the base ISO was 200. But you could turn on expanded ISO range in the menu on the camera, and on the Pro bodies you could do ISO 50 and above, which I frequently like to do to keep my images as clean as possible. Now, in the world of Fujifilm, which is what I shoot now, all of their cameras have a base ISO of 160. You can turn on the expanded ISO and get them down to ISO 80, and I do that from time to time. But not quite so much as I used to with the ISO 50. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just a mental thing. I don't know. It's not important. But anyways, we're talking about ISO today. So as you adjust your ISO on your camera, you make the sensor more or less sensitive to the ambient light. Now, as I mentioned, if you turn it up too high, you could end up introducing digital noise or digital pixelation in your images. Now, maybe you're looking for a film grain effect as a throwback to nostalgia to the film days. That's fine. If you want to do that, you're perfectly free to do that. But generally, when I'm shooting, especially for a client, I want as little to no noise as possible in my images. So I'm going to use the lowest possible ISO setting that I can. And if I have to, I'll make up for the ambient light by adding studio lights, whether it's mono lights, speed lights, continuous lights, whatever the case may be. So in this video, I'm going to show you, we're going to have a segment in this video where I will have one of my external recorders hooked up to one of my Fujifilm X-T4s so that you can see for yourself how ISO affects your images. So we're going to go ahead and get over to that segment of the video right now, and then I'll come back and we'll do a wrap up. Sample video here. You can see we start out with a shutter speed of 30 and an aperture of f1.8 and the base ISO of 160, which is normal on a Fujifilm camera as far as the base ISO, of course, being 160. Now you'll see as I turn the ISO up, the computer in the camera is going to automatically change the aperture to accommodate the ISO that I'm using. And the shutter speed is staying completely the same. There's no change in the shutter speed whatsoever. It's going to stay at what it was set for on the camera, because I had hard set it using the shutter speed control knob. So you see we're up to 12,800, and the image doesn't look grainy at f11 because of the fact that we're at f11. So the aperture is automatically compensating for the ISO, so everything still looks fairly clean. Now, we're going to go back down again, but then you're going to see that as we make a different change where we actually change the shutter speed, and then we adjust the aperture, you're going to see what a difference it makes, and you're going to see the grain, the digital pixelation, the noise that I was talking about earlier. You're going to see that get introduced into this video output from my Axoon CMO monitor and recorder. So see, now it's really dark. I'm at f16 at 30th of a second, and I have to crank the ISO way up because we're at f16. And then see what happens? We're at 12,800, but look at how grainy the image is. It looks horrible, absolutely terrible. With all that grain and noise and pixelation, it's just not a nice, crisp, clean video, so it's not going to be a nice, crisp, clean still photograph either. It's going to be messy. It's not going to look good at all when you're at ISO 12,800. So now you see, as we bring the aperture back down and then also bring the ISO down, we can clean the video up significantly. You see most of the noise disappear, and we go back to getting a clean video out, which is going to mean if we were shooting stills, the still images are going to be clean as well. We're not going to have any problems with the digital noise, the pixelations, the artifacts. It's going to be a nice, crisp, clean image. And you can see as I'm lowering the ISO, the aperture is turning back down to the bottom end, which is f1.8 on the Biltrox 85mm 1.8 Mark II lens. Shutter speed is still at a 30th of a second. And the camera is telling me that at f1.8, the perfect ISO is ISO 400. And you can see there we got nice, clean results. Okay, so as you saw in my demonstration video, if you turn the ISO up too high, then you get that graininess, the pixelation. It doesn't look good. Your images aren't going to look good. They're not going to look clean. They're not going to look professional. So your best bet, my rule of thumb, is always set your ISO as low as you possibly can to capture your image. Now, like I said, if you want to maintain a low ISO, but you have to use a higher aperture because maybe you don't have super wide prime lenses or whatever the case may be, you can compensate by using lights artificial lights in your image. So you could put on speed light, you could add a mono light, you could add a continuous light, whatever the case may be, so that you can keep that ISO down low, keep the grain and the noise out of your images, and give your clients clean, professional looking images that are free of any artifacts or any issues whatsoever. So you saw on my X-T4, as I adjusted the aperture and the ISO, you saw the graininess happen. And then when I turned it back down, you saw the camera compensate on its own because I was using a semi-auto mode. So you saw that as I was adjusting the ISO lower, it was making the aperture wider to compensate. So it was opening the lens up more to allow more light in through the lens to maintain a balanced exposure. And that little meter, that little scale you saw running up and down the left-hand side of the screen, that's your exposure meter right there. And when it's at 0, when it's in the dead center, that's when you have a perfectly balanced exposure between your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. Now remember, in Sunday's video, I'm going to wrap up this 3-part series from Photography 101, and we're going to talk about shutter speed, and I'm going to show you what different shutter speeds can do and how they can benefit you in your photography. Because I know a lot of you, if you're photography students, if you're just amateurs or hobbyists, you're doing it just for yourself, or you're taking family photos or vacation photos, whatever the case may be, you are going to want to know this information. So that's why I'm doing this 3-part on the exposure triangle under the Photography 101 playlist, which has aperture, now ISO, and then on Sunday, I'll include the shutter speed segment, and then you'll have the entire exposure triangle, and you'll have a better understanding of how to capture amazing images. All right, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment on it, hit the little bell icon so you can be notified when new videos release, and I will see you all again in the next one.